Today, we're going to talk about one of the most incredible and ruthless corporate takeovers in all of history. And no, this isn't some dusty old story. This is about how a publicly traded company, all about the bottom line, managed to conquer an entire nation.
Now, this isn't your typical story about a king or an emperor, with some grand vision of an empire. Nope. This is all about the British East India Company, also known as John Company, a business that just completely erased the lines between being a merchant, a military power, and, well, an empire.
And get this, it all started right here, in a pretty small office in London. Just a bunch of directors and shareholders making decisions that would, totally change the lives of millions of people, thousands and thousands of miles away.
So the big question is, how? How does a private company, basically just a group of traders, end up taking over a huge, wealthy subcontinent? Well, let's get into it.
All right, so by the early 1700s, John Company was already a huge success story. They were making just incredible amounts of money from their trading posts in India. But, and this is a big but, they were still just guests there, They were operating under the watchful eye of the really powerful Mughal Empire. But all of that was about to change.
The big turning point? It all kicks off in 1707. That's when the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb dies. Now, he'd been in charge for a long time, and he'd expanded the empire like crazy. But he also completely emptied the bank account doing it. And that left the empire really, really vulnerable.
And this timeline really shows you how quickly things fell apart. With the emperor gone, that central authority just vanished. All the local lords, these nawabs, they basically became their own kings. And into that power vacuum, you see the rise of the Maratha Empire, which pretty much turned the Mughal emperor into a puppet. So India wasn't one big unified empire anymore. It was this fragmented mess of states all fighting each other. And for a rich, ambitious company, well, that was the perfect opportunity.
So, to deal with all this chaos, the East India Company didn't just stick to trading. Oh no, it built something that had never really been seen before. Its own massive, professional, private army. And I mean, the size of this thing is just mind-blowing. By the end of the century, the company's private army had grown to over 200,000 soldiers. To put that in perspective, that's twice the size of the actual British Army at the time. A company had an army twice as big as its own countries.
Okay, but here's the really crucial detail about who was in this army. See, the company had a really hard time getting guys from Britain to sign up. So the huge majority of its army was actually made up of Indian soldiers. They were called sepoys, and they were armed, trained, and even dressed just like European soldiers.
And this quote from historian Ian Barrow just nails it. Think about the irony here. A British company's Indian empire was basically won for them by Indian troops. Why? Well, they were drawn in by good, steady pay, the promise of a pension, and, the status that came with serving in such a modern, powerful force.
But it wasn't just about the army. The company had two other massive weapons in its arsenal. First, money. A practically bottomless supply of cash from its investors meant it could just outspend anyone. And second, they were masters of diplomacy and, let's be honest, subterfuge. They were brilliant at playing Indian states off each other, making and breaking deals, and just creating chaos wherever it suited them.
Okay, so the company really learned how to combine all this, the military, the money, the politics, during something called the Carnatic Wars. This was basically a proxy war against their biggest business rival, the French East India Company. And it's here that one guy really starts to stand out.
His name was Robert Clive, and he started out as just a clerk for the company, but wow, was he bold. In 1751, he takes this massive risk, attacking the city of Arcot with just a tiny group of soldiers. And he doesn't just take the city, he holds it against an army that was 7 times bigger. It was such a shocking victory that back in London, the Prime Minister called him a heaven-born general.
So with all this new fame, Clive was obviously the guy they called for the next big problem. And that problem was in Bengal. The local ruler, the Nawab Siraj-ud-Dowlah, was getting pretty fed up with the company's growing power, so he attacked their main base in Calcutta and burned it down. So, of course, they sent Clive to handle it.
What happened next is known as the Battle of Plassey, and it's one of the most important moments in Indian history. But honestly, calling it a battle is a bit of a stretch. It was actually more like a business transaction, sealed with a giant bribe.
So look at the players here.
Clive has about 3,000 soldiers. He's up against the Nawab's army of almost 60,000. The odds are impossible, right? So Clive doesn't fight. He conspires. He makes a secret deal with the Nawab's own top general, a guy named Mir Jafar. And the plan? It's simple. Mir Jafar agrees to betray his boss and just stand down with most of the army. The reward? Clive promised to make him the new Nawab of Bengal.
And it worked, like perfectly. The battle begins and Mir Jafar's troops just don't move. The rest of the Nawab's army panics and it all just falls apart. Siraj-ud-Dawla tries to escape, but he's caught and executed. And just like that, the company has its puppet on the throne. A few years later, after another victory, they get formal control of tax collection. And if you control the taxes, you're the real ruler. They were now in charge of all of Bengal.
So what happened next wasn't about governing or building a new state. Not at all. It was one of the most ruthless, systematic examples of corporate asset stripping the world has ever seen.
And here's a little linguistic clue for you. It's no coincidence that the English word loot pops into the language right around this time. It comes directly from the Hindi word loot. Because that's exactly what was happening. The company's one and only goal was to suck as much money out of Bengal as they could and send it back to their shareholders in England.
The human cost of this was just catastrophic. A terrible famine hit Bengal in 1770, and the company's policies made everything so much worse. I mean, they were raising taxes on farmers who were already starving. The result? As many as 10 million people died. That was a third of the entire population.
And you know, people at the time weren't blind to this. They were horrified. The famous member of parliament, Edmund Burke, publicly blasted the company, saying that their business looked a whole lot more like robbery than trade.
And there were even some consequences for the guys in charge. Robert Clive, the heaven-born general, was dragged through Parliament for corruption. He ended up taking his own life. His successor, Warren Hastings, had to go through a famous 7-year-long impeachment trial. It just goes to show you that, even back in Britain, there was this growing sense of outrage about what this company was doing.
So, the story of John Company's conquest is, well, it's a shocking chapter of history. But it leaves us with a pretty big question, one that's just as relevant today. When a company starts acting like a state, when it has its own army, when it wages wars, when it rules over millions of people, who, at the end of the day, is held responsible?